Hello, thanks for joining us today. My name is San Bilal. I'm leading ECDPM work on development finance. And I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm going to be the moderator for the discussion that we will have today. Last year, following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, DAI, which is a savvy global development company, and ECDPM, the European Center for Development Policy Management, as an independent think and do tank, we decided to join forces to organize a series of webinars that brought together public and private practitioners to reflect on the immediate reaction of the development community and the support to the global response of the European Union to the COVID-19 crisis. And with my DAI friends, Mathilde Gaston-Mate and Monique Apero, we thought it would be a good idea to continue this series this year, building on the success from last year, focusing this time more on the lessons so far and on the way forward to build back better for greener and more inclusive gender-sensitive recovery, harnessing public and private sector endeavors. And in this series, we will address issues from gender empowerment and green recovery. We'll do that after the summer break. To issues such as the recovery in conflict-affected and fragile countries. We'll have a webinar on the 30th of June on this, and the opportunities and challenges of digital inclusion on June 19. So knowing that many of these topics are in fact interconnected, it seems to us though that it would be a good idea to start with agriculture, which is still the dominant sector in many developing countries, and in particular in Africa, where agriculture accounts over 60% of the population, and in some countries even over 80% of the population. And we thought that agriculture could be the basis for both an inclusive recovery and for sustainable transformation of their economies, notably along value chains and agri-food systems. So we hear sometimes that agriculture, and in particular by smallholder farmers and MSMEs, is not a profitable activity, or at least not profitable enough to attract significant private investment. And is that really the case? And that's what we will discuss today. Are there not ways to attract more investment? We also find that many of the initiatives tend to focus on the production side of agriculture only. And that some of the interventions are perhaps too much segmented and with not sufficient considerations to the agri-food systems as a whole, which comprises, in fact, numerous actors, including financiers, and sometimes, in particular, along value chains. So the questions we're asking is really, what are the innovative and promising approaches which could help boost sustainable recovery through agri-food markets? And to discuss these questions, we have a very impressive panel with us today, which I'll introduce in a minute. But first, perhaps just some very practical information. We would ask you during this discussion to switch off your camera and your microphone so we could have good sounds during the discussions. And we would encourage you, though, to ask your questions through the chat function that you could find at the bottom right of your screen. And if you put your questions there, we can take them during the conversations, and we'll also dedicate some time at the end of this webinar to form Q&A type of discussions if needs be. The second point I would like to stress is that this is really going to be a discussion. There will be no PowerPoints and no formal presentations, and we've gathered there very insightful experts that will speak freely and will intervene how they see fit, and in such a way to have a very lively discussions. Let me turn then first to Bettina Prato, who is senior coordinator for of the SAFIN, the Smallholder and Agri SME Finance and Investment Network at the IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development. Bettina, you are really one of the key personalities in this field. What brought you to the question of agriculture?
Thank you, San. I don't know that I see myself as one of the key personalities in the field, but thank you. I'm honored to hear that that is the perception. So what brought me to agriculture? You know, I come from a small rural village in the north of Italy, and actually my grandparents were farmers. My grandfather was actually a landless agricultural worker, and that's you know, migrating for labor. That's how we met my grandmother. But on a personal, in terms of personal backgrounds, most of my background is really in politics, actually, in particularly politics, the politics of identity in fragile situations. You know, I've worked a lot in the Middle East in particular. And over the past 20 or so years, I've worked in the space of development cooperation with a lot of interest in innovative finance and generally speaking, the catalytic use of development finance in different areas. And I find that agriculture is one of the most exciting and dynamic sectors for development finance to be used catalytically today. So that's something that keeps me very engaged with the kind of issues that we addressed as SAFIN in relation to agri-SMEs, but also more broadly with a conversation around how to use finance really as an enabler of positive transformations in agriculture today. Again, very, very dynamic sector. So I look forward to answering your question. You know, is it true that there isn't much of a business case for investment in agriculture today? Over.
Great, thank you very much, Bettina. Susan van Tilburg, I saw you nodding when Bettina was saying this is a very exciting field. You are the head of the global head food and agriculture networks at Rabobank, but you started as a diplomat. So what brought you to the field of agriculture?
Just like Bettina, I'm also from a farmer family, but a different type of farming family. So I'm really a member, let's say, of a dairy farmer family, which is really huge. My parents both had like tens of sisters and brothers, typically Dutch southern part agricultural setting. So my heart was already there. But it really started to take off when I joined indeed the Dutch diplomatic force as agriculture attaché and counselor worldwide. And after, I think, about 20 years of connecting the ambitions of the Dutch government to the business propositions for the companies in the Netherlands, I really thought, well, this is nice, but it all remains at facilitation, pre-competitive arrangements. When can I be the one making that actual change? And when I was in touch with Rabobank, coordinating also the top sector food and agri for the Netherlands on international propositions, I noticed that Rabobank was like the ideal yard with the right tools to really help and connect and build those bridges, but also come up with the right business models and guide the clients, whether it's smallholder farmers in Africa to game-changing entrepreneurs with farmers bigger than the Netherlands itself in Australia or Brazil. That is the network of Rabobank. And to me, that was really an eye-opener, because coming from this Dutch farming family, I thought this was just a cooperative Dutch bank. So it was an eye-opener, and it really, I did not regret it for 1 second, but I must admit, I'm still feeling like some type of Alice in Wonderland in this banking situation and environment, which makes it very interesting to bridge the gap between public and private sector, but also between the farmer target group and the consumer target group, and the companies, of course, involved. So it's a very nice mix of all types of stakeholders, and what we're trying to do right now is to make those exact nice connections in which 1 and 1 is 3 ultimately.
Yeah, right. Well, in fact, in your position and with your background, you're perfect to do this mix and connection between the public and private sector. Masterbrookes, you are at DG International Partnership at the European Commission dealing with private sector and agribusiness. Are you also from a farmer's family background, or what attracted you to this topic?
Hello to everybody. No, I have no family background in farming at all. My arrival in the agriculture sector was far more related to a lot of the work I'd been doing with the European Commission out in the field when I was posted in Zambia and Mozambique, where I worked on the agriculture files, but at in situ, if you like. And when I came back, I was delighted to attempt to combine at least a lot of the economics background I had and try to apply it to the thinking around promotion of agriculture, in particular promotion of agricultural private sector, so commercial agriculture, for still in the aim of benefiting the smaller farmers, or at least improving development prospects in the country. So I came at it from that angle, but no family link at all. Sorry.
No, this is fine. In fact, this is probably also the way for the future, is that agriculture is not only about farmers. It's also about many other actors coming along to address it. Bill Grant, you are Senior Principal Global Practice Specialist, Agricultural and Market Systems at DAI. So a partner for this series of webinars. Again, same question. What do you think agriculture is so important? What brought it to you for you?
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here with everybody. As you mentioned, I've been with DI. I've been with DI actually for about 35 years, and so a lot of my development career. But I've been very active in rural development issues since the 1970s when I started in the Central African Empire. But my family background is actually a development background. My great-grandfather was a doctor in China. My grandfather was the first doctor of public health in China. My father was the head of UNICEF, and so I grew up in development. And in the late 1970s, when I actually started to get out and see what the problems were, agriculture was a major one. And so I went back and got a degree in business and ag economics at Stanford. And then I joined DAI, and I've been working I've worked in 60 countries around the world, addressing, agricultural value chain challenges. And since market systems started about 20 years ago, when DFID really kind of broached it as the making markets work for the poor approach, I've been very active in driving market systems development in these different countries and different projects, looking at cultural finance, which is where I actually started with a lot of work in the late 80s, and then moved into value chains and other things thereafter.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. In fact, you were saying you came into the topic because agriculture was in the 70s very important and crucial for development. Interestingly, and nowadays this is still the case, though perhaps we talk more about agribusiness and in a broader perspective. But for a lot of countries, in fact, the industrialization and transformation process also come from agriculture. You mentioned the word market systems. Could you tell us what market systems are about, and how, what is specific to your approach around market systems?
That's a big topic, and to give
just a definition,
just do justice in a few seconds. But no, it's really around. It starts with saying, well, what are the problems that the people have, and then unpacking. So if we say we want finance, everybody knows that finance is a problem for farmers, and the question is why? Well, banks don't want to lend to them. Why? Farmers never have good business plans. Farmers don't have collateral. There's 1,000 issues. But it's about unpacking those problems and then working with the market actors. So it's not the donors coming from the outside doing it. It's really trying to position the market actors to do the work directly. And the more you get the market actors doing it, the more sustainable it is. The more we have the Rabobanks kind of investing, they're doing it because they make money. They have an incentive to do it. And the more they can reach smallholder farmers, the more they can reach agribusinesses. And oftentimes, you get embedded finance. So a Rabobank might lend to a big processor who would then kind of develop relationships with the farmers. But we've been applying this across Africa and the Middle East and Asia with great effectiveness. And it was kind of interesting since this kind of came out of the COVID challenge. What we've been finding is that market systems, when you get a good infrastructure of local market actors who are working together, it makes a system more resilient because you're not waiting for outside things. It's the market actors, the farmers, the consultants, the local players who have an incentive to make it work. And we found that, when the challenges that were brought on by COVID happened, it really made it much easier in areas where we had built up these networks and had functioning market systems, that the market systems adapted very quickly, and they were able to respond to the crises much more easily than people coming from. So market systems development is about long-term sustainability and really providing an exit strategy for those of us who want to see development happen.
But quite often, especially in poorer countries or in rural areas, what we hear is that the market forces do not necessarily work very well, and also that risks are perceived to be too high, in particular for more informal agriculture and smallholder farmers and small SMEs complain that the banking, the financial sector does not work for them because the interest rates are too high and so on. So how can we address this? Who wants to? I mean, I know I'm asking a big question, but Bettina, or you want, because this is what you're trying to do also with your Safin.
No, it's perhaps an even bigger question than the question of market systems, or it's the same question. I mean, I think that what Bill was saying is right. It's absolutely right in the sense that at the end of the day, there is no quick fix to get more finance or better finance to flow in the sector, and particularly to flow towards also the smaller actors in the sector, the smallholder farmers, the informal, sort of entrepreneurs that are very often sort of the majority of the actors involved in food value chains and in food systems in general from an economic point of view. There's no quick fix because unless the market infrastructure works better, then ultimately you only have band-aid solutions to either the problem of transaction costs or the problem of risk. And I'm saying this as someone who's done a lot of work also in recent times, as you know, San, on blended finance, for example. Even blended finance very often delivers very interesting results in the sector, but in the absence of interventions that better connect demand and supply, sort of better connect the market fundamentals, so that growing demand for high quality products, sustainably produced products, etc., really feeds back all along the chain to producers, and the obstacles to the flow of goods and services back to the consumers are removed, then you're only going to have very transitional benefits. So, you can do risk-specific investment. You can get an X number of companies funded, but that's it. You're going to have, sort of the portfolio in agriculture of a bank to increase over a period of time, and then it will just go back to where it was. So I think what we're talking about here, the direction in which we're going, is about trying to really address in a systematic way, not just the flow of finance, the supply of finance, but building the capacity of the market to absorb finance, building the demand side of finance. And for that, I think, these platforms that bring different actors together are very important. But I would add something to this. I also think it is really important to have, for governments, public sector players, to have a vision, to have a vision of where a sector, where a subsector or a value chain needs to be and can be. And what are the measures, the initiatives, policy related, regulatory, investment related, that need to be taken to support that. it's not just a matter of bringing market actors together. It's also a matter of sound policy making, of also a visioning, what I call sort of a visioning exercise, having a roadmap for where you want the sector to be. And for that, the public sector is really critical for me. So very long answer, just to say no quick fix to risk.
Okay, there are indeed many challenges. Matt, is that the kind of approach that the Commission is taking? Because the European Commission as a donor, we started with Bill telling us that it's about markets, it's not about donors. But now Bettina tells us that you have to have a very holistic approach and capacity building. Bill, sorry?
No, I was just going to say, I didn't say it wasn't about donors. It was about the right role for donors and how donors should engage with the markets, not crowd them out, but to encourage them, to incentivize them. And I just agree with Bettina that, any market system has kind of that core supply demand, but then there's the supporting infrastructure and there's the legal and regulatory framework that kind of sets the picture. And I'll let Matthew answer now.
Oh, yeah, that sounds to me very much like some of the pillars of this external investment plan, where you have finance. Of course, in the case of the external investment plan is the blended finance, and then you have technical assistance and then regulatory and policy dialogue. Is that the kind of approach you're taking at the Commission, or how do you sort it out, this big conundrum, Matt?
How do you sort it out is, I think, probably the biggest question so far. I was actually going to agree with the two previous speakers. I think, Bill, I wasn't going to pick a fight with that. I thought you pointed out very well the fact that this does not belong to the donors. The donors' role is really to help it along, to be a supportive facilitation type influence. It's got to be done locally. It's got to be done with local systems and local actors. And with Bettina, I will pick a fight because she expresses extremely well exactly what I'd written down to say, which is quite irritating sometimes. But it underlines what you said in introducing her in the first place. What we are trying to do in the European Commission is it is a combination of things. So you point to the external investment plan, which emphasizes an awful lot some of these new financing instruments whose objective is, of course, to make available capital to de-risk some of the investment that currently isn't taking place. And that is in recognition of the fact that not only in agriculture, but it goes well beyond agriculture. There are market failures, which mean capital isn't flowing the way one would have hoped. But there's also recognition, I think, increasingly clear recognition that in particular in agriculture, the risk-adjusted returns are simply low for various reasons. I think Bill threw in the sort of prevailing context of macroeconomic situation leading to very high interest rates in general. That is one that you can't solve in the agriculture sector, but it is one of the consistent elephants we have in the room, which is that you need to find ways to deal with prevailing interest rates, and that's to do with macroeconomic management. So I mention it because I think it's one of the first elements we have in honestly saying there are a whole series of players who need to come along with this. You can't solve it by just de-risking individual deals. Exactly what Bettina said. You can have an attractive project, and you can measure your beneficiaries, and you can say, look, we solved the problem for these 5,000 people. But you won't solve the problem for their 5,000 neighbors unless you start addressing the systems more effectively. And so it's quite clear when we make available capital, when we work with our development finance institutions, say, look, let's improve the supply of capital. That goes part of the way, but it is sort of pushing a string in many senses. And you need to find a way to pull that string. And once you start looking at demand for capital, we always say it, and Bettina says it extremely well, everybody wants money. But the demand for capital is not people wanting money, it's actually people wanting money who are a credible prospect of paying back. And the bankers here, ex-bankers and bankers will obviously agree with that. If you can't pay the money back, then you've got a major problem in accessing capital. But it points to some of the answers. You mentioned, I'm sure we had value chains in the sort of subject title. one of the ways of improving the demand is simply to strengthen the value chains, and the value chains are strengthened substantially by public investments. It's one of the things we try to feed into our speeches, our own speeches, and our sort of senior management speeches, is that private investment results from public investment in terms of things, in terms of making markets function more happily through infrastructure, through investment in very basic stuff, education, business education, financial literacy, capacity building, but also public investment in time and effort and commitment, in sitting around the tables, some of these business fora at the local level, talking to local players, getting a handle and understanding, I think, a grip on what are the barriers to investment at the local level. I'm often criticized, and I have a limited career, in fact, because I object to discussions of obstacles to investment that take place in Brussels or that take place in Addis, unless they relate to problems in Ethiopia. Because it simply remains at a level that's exceedingly distant from the actual market players. And so we're increasingly, I think, trying to connect up with local actors and give impetus to local efforts to improve the investment climate. And it is unlikely to have a sort of long-term improvement unless people are genuinely committed to it. And it's very difficult. The easiest thing is to say what has to be done. The most difficult thing is actually to find realistic solutions in the local context. So you can give dynamism to it in Addis and in Brussels and in Washington, or in Paris, like yesterday, but you can't actually solve it unless you get local and get pretty specific and start working with the people who know what is going on in the local context on the ground.
Yeah.
That was a long answer too, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is obvious, but I would say that's probably true for any kind of development type of endeavor. It's not specific to agriculture. Yet you mentioned that you were saying that there's low risk-adjusted returns, high interest rates, and we ask people to be able to pay back. So and that seems to be a scenario that is repeated across continents in different local contexts. So there might be some systemic issues, and perhaps let me turn to Suzanne as a banker from a perspective. How do you see some systemic solutions to address this element? First, is it really true that the risk-adjusted returns are so low, or is it because there's a perceived risk that is too high, or because not the right measures? How do you address it yourself when you're seeing different deals and so on? What's your approach to it?
Well, I wish there was just one approach. That first and foremost.
What are your approaches? Let's put the plural to it.
If we would have that magic key, we would ultimately solve everything. Now, I think a lot has been said, and I in principle, I can agree with everything that's been said by the previous speakers. But I think from a bank's perspective, first, it starts with being engaged as finance sector in a much earlier stage. I think that is maybe even part of the problem and could be part of the solution. If the finance sector would have been engaged in many of these dialogues already from the beginning, then I think you would be able to come up with more bankable solutions instead of the outcomes policy recommendations that are not economically viable, for instance. We've seen too many cases of that in the past, and I think this is one of the targets that our bank has at a global scale, to be really a stakeholder from the beginning instead of being that closing piece, a problem in the end, but part of the solution by being there. When it comes to the transformations that I think on the basis of what Rabobank is experiencing already for decades now all over the world, is that now we are gradually more looking into food system approaches in which we also take into account sustainability transitions, not only the socio-economic consequences. I think there are a few approaches that need to be changed by all stakeholders. And first of all, and a few of these have been said, but the way we look at it is that first of all, we have to take an approach in which you consider an ecosystem instead of just a group of smallholder farmers, for instance, that you really look into the rural livelihood, but also the market around it. Because it's not about access to finance anymore. This is all about access to markets. And still, it's surprisingly big, the amount of projects, even from big public funds and development banks, targeting only the incomes of smallholders. That's surprising if you look at the effects in the long term, but also the almost reliability of those smallholder groups on those type of public fundings. Sorry, my cat is in my way, but then I think it's better to really look at it as from an overall approach and not only look at the smallholder farmers, but also to the other parts in the chain and the off-takers of those smallholder farmers, including the SMEs and the stores in the corner of the street in local villages. Because we have noticed, and that has an advantage, because if you look at it from an ecosystem approach, for us as a bank, it's much more easy, next to, of course, cooperatives and producer organizations, to approach these ecosystems with solutions that are more feasible. For instance, with digitized solutions, with data sets that are becoming more accessible, but also because you have more transparency and traceability opportunities in the value chain and in the local value chains. So that is first and foremost, I think, the way that we gradually look at it, and that's why we have a smallholder ecosystem department now in our bank. As of the beginning of this year, it's only targeting smallholder ecosystem solutions. Secondly, I think what is very important is to also not forget the connection between consumers on the one hand and the farmers on the other hand, whatever type of farmers. But it too much still, it's only looked at it from a producer perspective. I had a very interesting World Farmers Organization dialogue this morning, one of the many independent dialogues in the up-one to the Food System Summit. And I was thrilled by the fact that now they are talking. Consumers International, World Farmer Organization, and many other stakeholders, but they are talking, and they are also talking about the true value of food. And I strongly believe that if these two groups, both at the end of the chain, on the different end of the chains, if they are able to address the policymakers and politics with the ambition to really have true pricing in the end and to have the true value of food reflected in those prices, I think that will ultimately drive the transformation in the most quick and the most sustainable way. To give one example, yesterday I attended a roundtable on sustainable soy, which is still a very, very low share worldwide. And we had farmers complaining that they were not even willing to pay $1,000 of audit costs just to become certified for sustainable soy. It doesn't pay well enough. There is no incentive. But if there would be a real good, transparent way to calculate natural costs and social costs, I mean, we as a bank, we would be thrilled to be able to issue social impact bonds. But please tell us, when are those bonds social? So the frameworks, the metrics, in order to get the right criteria to do that, I think that would ultimately help us move forward. And then the third, and then I'll stop for a moment, but I think the third important notice is that the value chain approach is not being targeted by development banks, by the big public funds. And this is really of concern. We as a bank, we are trying to invest in local banks because indeed it doesn't make sense as a global food and agri bank to finance smallholders on a one-on-one basis. So what we are trying to do on our side is to raise funds and invest in the local banks, and they will be able then to come up with more food and agri financing, which is really something that needs a lot of attention still in many developing countries. I think Bettina knows as well as we do. But if you look at how the funds are being directed now through governmental programs, and this was said also by Matthew, that are not really structuring the right infrastructure and logistics to support the business models that ultimately could drive that transformation in such an ecosystem approach, for instance, on food loss and waste reduction. I mean, we as a bank would love to invest in food loss and waste reduction. Our hands itch because we see pipeline possibilities to really get good funding for cold storage, cold chain solutions, warehousing. But if there's no roads to transport your perishables, it doesn't make any sense. And that is what I truly believe the ultimate way of dealing with this is to get that discussion on the table between the public and the private partners, including the public, the governments and the public stakeholders from developing countries where you have a lot of smallholds being dependent on them. And otherwise, no funding is making any sense for a long term, at least in our eyes.
Yeah, thanks a lot. You address a range of issues, so I'm not so sure which one I should take. Bettina, you want to? You all want to respond. So Bettina.
Yeah. I wanted to. Oh, was Matt first?
No, Bettina.
No. Okay.
First, yeah.
No, I wanted to react to something you said and also to something that Suzanne said. So it's about this question of the balance between costs and risks, costs and returns, and when it makes sense from an investment perspective, when it doesn't. So first of all, I mean, I think that the data that we have suggests that the risk cost return ratios are really different depending on context, depending on supply chain, depending on market. So there are value chains, there are markets where it's possible to make a better return than in others. So the business case, even under the status quo, is not the same everywhere. But it is true that if you look at the evidence, for example, on where most of the costs of individual investors, even impact investors that are targeting small and medium enterprises in agriculture, where they're mostly coming from, it's deal origination. It's sort of monitoring. I mean, there are costs that can be significantly reduced through the kind of public investments that both Suzanne and Matt were talking about. The investments in both the hard and the soft infrastructure of market connectivity, digital data systems, but also roads. I mean, frankly, sort of once you drive down the costs, you are also better able to preserve the value of produce once it, all the way to the market. And so the quality and the price associated with that also improves. Having said that, I'm fully with Suzanne that we also need to address proper pricing. There's a range of attributes around more sustainably produced agriculture goods and services that is just not there, where it needs to be to give the right signals to investors. The last small point I wanted to make is to go back to what Bill said at the beginning. I think we have a bit of a tension here between discussing a value chain approach versus a market building approach. And for me, one of the things that are fascinating about agriculture compared to other sectors, as you pointed out, San, is that here, if you take a local market perspective, that will localize the lens through which you're looking at the problems. Many of the existing supply chains, particularly the best organized, are not meant to serve local markets. So they are actually generating or sustaining dynamics that are not necessarily conducive to positive local market development. So that's why talking about markets, talking about ecosystems that Suzanne was saying, in a way, is better than just talking about a value chain perspective when it comes to agriculture. Sorry, and now I'll mute myself.
It's better. My question is whether it is, because there's a sense of rhetoric when we talk about development. You need to have more infrastructure, you need to have better markets, you need to have better regulatory principles. So, I mean, this is kind of, of course, this is the general endeavor, but I'm sure that, for Bill, who has been there since the 70s, this was already the same discourse. So one of the questions is whether a value chain approach is not a way to connect the producers to the markets, and to try then to along a specific, and that doesn't need necessarily to be an international value chain, can be a local value chain. And if that's trying to, but that's a question I'm putting to all of you, if that could be an approach where instead of thinking like Suzanne was mentioning, only financing producers. I mean, there's a question from it just moved now, but from Misol Carcueva, who was saying, the prompt for farmers' organizations is to accessing financial services, and whether there are solutions to and best practice to address that. But one of my questions, and please do address this question, but one of the possible suggestion is, would bringing the different actors along a value chains or an or local ecosystem, but connecting the producers to the consumers, to think about the markets, not to think in general it would be nice to improve. And then if you bring the different actors, including the financiers and the different financiers, financing the small ones, but also the large ones, and connecting them, is that a way to try to create, and from the early stage, is that a way to lead not only at the end to the financing of the specific value chain, but to improvement of the ecosystem? Now that's a big question that I'm putting to you, Bill, and then Matt.
No, thank you very much. For me, the value chain approach, and I don't want to talk about just the value chain, but the value chain approach is a systemic approach, because it looks at the entire system. One of the really important things, and it was kind of a more to me, because traditionally we've thought, oh, value chain, it's a supply chain, and you produce, you add 10%, you add 10%, and that's the supply chain until it gets to the end consumer. But actually, value chain starts with who puts the value in value chain. It's the consumer, as was being said. And I think that what's completely disconnected is from the consumer to the producer. So the producers don't know what the consumer wants. And this is particularly true in Africa, in really highly fragmented value chains, where you have 6 or 7 layers, and each person's trying to maximize their profits at each layer of the value chain, instead of kind of understanding, how do we all win? What are the win-win relationships that can be established to incentivize people to get their certification so that they can produce organic soy, or to invest in the right technologies to produce the right products? So you need to understand all the connections in the value chain in order to make that, and then you have to solve each one of them individually. But they're all systems, and we have to be looking at them in terms of, where are the supporting services that are needed? If you want a soy certification, is there a certification company doing it? There is in.
And can you give concrete examples? I mean, you've worked in, I think, in Nigeria and Ethiopia and in different countries. Could you give some concrete examples of how these kind of things have been done? And there was this question of what are some of the successful best practices. What can you identify? I've seen some of your papers where you identify a lot of recommendations, so I'm not asking you to summarize them all, but what would that be?
I mean, it's the connectivity. It's getting people talking with one another and understanding what the issues are for each other, and understanding how, if one does it better, that there's a mutual incentive for the other person.
Do you have a concrete case of to materialize what you want to say, that you could give us to illustrate in a couple of minutes? But
this is a case from Nigeria, which we know is always one of the worst and most difficult places to work. And the government has tried to do lots of programs to get finance to people, and they end up being defaulted on, and the government lines of credit always kind of fail. But over the years, they've adapted, and they've adapted by using local service providers. And actually, the local service providers who have been helping businesses prepare their business plans have been recommending and advising the central bank on how to structure these programs. And so now the central bank has taken their advice and is putting the local service providers much more in support, so that they not only help people prepare business plans to get the loans, but they then provide the ongoing support to the company and are on the hook to help make sure that the companies repay. So, and it took 15 years to kind of get to this solution, because the bank came in with one approach and then they realized they needed something else and they kind of bought into service, but they never brought all the market actors together to say, how can we make this work better so that everybody's incentivized to work? And now the government has changed its basic approach. More people are getting loans, more people are paying back their loans, which is the most important thing. And you now have an ecosystem of support services that are out there working to make sure that interests are aligned. And so you can then take this and put it into a specific value chain. Say it's, the cocoa value chain in Nigeria, where the quality of cocoa being produced is just abysmal because of government pricing, because of the disconnectedness between the exporters and the farmers. That when you bring them together and you take away some of the disincentivizing policies the government has put in place, you actually get the exporters talking to the farmers saying, this is the quality standard we need to get. And the farmers have been absolutely clueless about this. But now that we have the conversations going between the farmers and the exporters, they're saying, okay, now we know that you need this level of dryness, you need this level of cleanliness, we'll produce it for you. But in the middle, there have always been traders who've been kind of saying, well, just give us crappy production and we'll clean it up and we'll make the extra margin, without thinking that, well, if they get better product to begin with, they will be able to sell it, not have to invest as much in cleaning, and they'll have a better product that they can on-sell to the exporters. So it's connecting players and making sure that the systems around them are working as well. But that's one example, just in the cocoa value chain, that we've helped do in Nigeria.
Makes it very real to all of us. Matt, sorry, I kept you waiting. You also wanted to come in on some of these issues, where in fact the Commission has a very important role, also bringing different actors together. No, you're muted. You should unmute yourself, and then we can hear you.
Somebody muted me. I've been using a different mute. Look, I mean, I will say a few things. I've been trying to disagree with somebody. I mean, it's a panel, so I'm having a go at a small disagreement, because in fact, I think we're very aligned in terms of opinions so far. I'm going to try and disagree with Suzanne, who pointed to, and it actually, I think it underlines slightly different perspectives at which, from which we address the same topic. She points to the need for value chains to look far more at accessing markets, which is quite interesting, of course, because from my perspective, we have a long history of attempting to promote value chains, and starting very much with the stuff being grown in the ground and getting it to market. And my conclusion is that we haven't adequately been addressing access to capital once we've tried to address the access to market. So I have a feeling that the next step for us is going to have to be to improve, if you want, our value chains programs, in order to address more concretely how the players who are involved in the value chain can actually start accessing capital once they've accessed the market. So in fact, I'm agreeing, but it's interesting that in Suzanne kind of says, look, I assume you've come from access to capital being made available and saying, oh, the access to market really matters. And so it's increasingly important to reduce the gap between those two. And we will be pushing that much more actively, I think, especially as we try and promote, these innovative financing instruments. One area where we've tried already, we've set up a fund. We call it the ABC Fund. We set it up with IFAD, and it's really an attempt to improve the access to finance for smallholders, not directly, but with a fund that either invests in suitable opportunities for investment tickets below $1 million, which is exceedingly difficult to make money off because of the transaction cost of finding suitable opportunities, but also in local banks, if you wish, again, in the aim of improving access for smallholders. at again smaller ticket sizes. And we've pushed very hard a collaboration between the fund, which is a commercially oriented fund, and farmers' organizations. We have, again, a long history of supporting farmers' organizations with straightforward public funding, grant assistance. But it's an area where we've said, okay, we've helped you become more representative. We've helped you have a stronger capacity to stand up and interact with governments, to represent yourselves, to organize yourselves. You need to think of access to capital. And working with a range of farmers' organizations, some have been very successful in doing so and already accessing capital, improving their membership's ability to be credible counterparts, and others aren't. And so at least there, two things. One is to say, learn from each other. How come some of you can, some of you can't? You have to engage too. We expect more from you, frankly. On the other side, to get them closer to those who are providing capital, get them into the conversations, because smallholders alone simply can't join those conversations. But once you manage to aggregate, and aggregation applies to all sorts of areas in this topic, but aggregating smallholders via farmers' organizations seems to be one of those untapped sources where the farmers' organizations could play more of a role if fund managers start looking at them more seriously. And of course, somebody has to help that along by making precisely the connections that Bill was referring to, and public money is justified in supporting that connection and supporting that capacity, if you wish. That was just one example we have in practice, but we are trying.
Yeah, no, but since you were asking for challenges for speakers, I mean, you know, isn't not a problem, and that's a question to both you, Matt, and Bettina, but is not a problem that this agribusiness capital ABC fund that you provide is in fact trying to address only one part of the problem, which is to finance smallholder farmers. And you're saying, well, get organized and you get better access, which is partly true. But Suzanne was telling us that, you know, this is not how you solve the issue, because you have to think about consumers and you have to connect these different actors. So shouldn't be the role of an ABC fund to also or be part of a larger network to really be effective to be able to do this connection. And so that's perhaps a question. And I remember, Suzanne, you were telling me when we were preparing this in one of our previous discussions that Rabobank is not just a financier, but is a facilitator. So perhaps that's my question. Should an ABC fund also try to be a facilitator? And perhaps, Suzanne, you want to explain what you mean by being a facilitator.
Yeah, and maybe in response also to, because I fully understand what Matthew is saying. And by the way, I was also talking from my own experience with the Dutch public money, in which we openly admit that many of those funds were more issued towards NGOs, being consultants in those developing countries, and the direct finance indeed to smallholders, which in the end didn't really help that much for the long term. Whereas what we see is missing is the incentives from the business perspective on both sides. So just to give a very clear example, we have a lot of Dutch companies that are very anxious to invest in smallholder programs with good business propositions, for instance, on cold chains or fresh fruits and vegetables storages. The problem is that they don't have the time to come up with a good business plan, and they are too small themselves. They're not big corporates, they're too small themselves. They're SMEs usually, to really think in a strategic way, to get to know the market. So I do miss somehow that connection in the pre-competitive phase already, where you could have more money maybe made publicly available to those type of pre-competitive propositions, in which the business cases themselves, between the ones from other countries maybe wanting to invest in that, but for sure also the local stakeholders, will be facilitated indeed in getting the right business case. Because once the profit dot is on the horizon, things will flow automatically, and then it's perfect that there's a lot of public funding to underline that and to support that. Including the infrastructure needed around that, and of course the government contacts and the right limitation of trade restrictions and things like that, so on the public field. So getting back to your question, yes, San, I think the facilitation in our view is really in connecting the right dots, involving the right stakeholders. And to give one example where we are not using any money at all, in which no dollar, no euro is being used, is a farm to market alliance in which we provide, in which we have the off-takers of the harvest of the smallholders invest themselves in the high quality seeds that the farmers can use to get better yields, to get better harvests, so that you have like a vicious circle in that small value chain in which no money is needed, because we experience as a bank that if we provide money, smartphones might be bought. Of course, I'm generalizing now, but the money might go to other purposes instead of investing it in the right business models on those farms. And with these type of ecosystem approaches in the value chain locally, we have good experience that all parties involved are being supported and can create that market and keep it sustainable for the longer run. If that is what you mean with our facilitator role, but I'm not sure.
I don't know. I was just asking you what you mean by your facilitating role. You're doing the facilitation, not me. Bettina, you wanted or Matt,
Yeah,
you wanted to react?
Yeah, let me respond to this. I think there's no way we can overestimate the importance of the kind of actors that are willing to actually invest in the time, the social capital, the money also that is needed to bring the different actors around the table. I mean, this is something that seems like, okay, you just convene, you call a meeting, just like something you do on the side. It's really the hardest part of getting things done. Sort of, I say this also as coordinator of a network. Sometimes the results are not as visible as the investment that you put into it. It's not necessarily so common for a financial institution like Rabobank to be the actor that does that. I mean, I'm looking, for example, at the experience of IFAD with what is called the 4P model. The public-private producer partnerships, where IFAD has sort of played this role of convener of different value chain actors in a number of countries, trying to really broker their relationships among different value chain actors to understand what needs to be put down in a contract, what can be left unspoken, just spoken, verbal, what requires some public investment, what requires some capacity building up, how to build the flow of relationships and value creation that is necessary, and it's a very, very expensive investment. It's a critical one, and it's also one that very often, sort of when I hear from companies that operate in agtech or in fintech, for example, that have these digital innovations with potential to generate good returns. You ask, would it be useful for you to have donors engaged in blending, to de-risk some of your investments to scale this up? And they say, no, we would really like for donors to help us have the conversations that we need to have with the different players in the ecosystem, because for us, it's an additional cost and it's not part of our business model. So it's a really, really important function that Suzanne was referring to, and I think it's one that in many cases is a good fit for donors or development partners, for that matter. I don't know if you wanted me to respond on the ABC fund, but I leave it to Matt to start with.
Matt, both for the role of donors. By the way, I mean, I'm wondering if the role of donors is not to provide capacity building for local actors, including local public actors, to do this. I mean, ultimately, that should be local solutions. But Matt, I don't want to put words in your mouth. So,
no, it's fine. It is in my. I take it in my mouth gladly.
I'll have those words too. I think I mean, yes, it's absolutely the approach. The donors should not be, again, as we said at the outset, donors should not be leading this. You have to be facilitating local instances. Do I think the ABC fund should be leading, in some sense, a sort of convening of actors? I think that's probably a little bit idealistic. I don't think it will happen. It's one single. I mean, we have to be we have to be realistic on what an investment fund or fund manager can do. And in that sense,
but should it be integrated, if not leading? Sorry for interrupting, but shouldn't it be part of what we're talking before about market system, ecosystem approaches, and so on? So my question is, rather than focusing on just providing support to a fund and say, please go about it, shouldn't be the approach also in terms of support be more global, and so that such a fund, not for the fund manager in herself or to be leading, but to be integrated into an approach where you connect different actors? That's perhaps the question.
I mean, I think I suspect we'd all agree with the integration. Integration is a big word of bringing together. I think connecting up those who would be beneficiaries or clients for an investment and the investor, and trying to understand the obstacles they face and try to address these relatively low risk-adjusted returns, but also try and improve the information around it for the investor. I think this is roughly what Bettina says. As always, I'm copying what she says. The biggest cost they face is attempting to originate viable deals. And with the ABC fund, since we follow it quite closely, we see them. They talk to 8 companies in some detail, and only one will make it to the investment committee for genuine review, for genuine assessment. And of those, only kind of half would actually advance again to investment. So they spend a lot of, these are the classic boot leather costs, but there's an awful lot of it because it's so hard to discover. The information availability is difficult. Is there a case for the public sector coming in and saying, we can help you with the information surrounding the potential customers? I'm not sure. There may be a case for a sort of general public support to improving the information around potential investees, potential companies that would be subject of an investment. When I talk to my colleagues who are investors, that's not an easy conversation because you don't quite know what they want, and they don't necessarily all want the same thing. So one investor's informational requirement is not the same as the next. And if they could align a little bit their needs, it would make it easier to say, yes, I can do a sort of support for pre-investment or pre-competitive origination. I could help you at least with the discovery mechanism, the basic information that you want to know, because it's information. Knowledge can be a genuine public contribution, and that allows them then to compete around the viable customers. That is, in a sense, the easy thing if we could simply agree on the sort of informational requirements. The more complicated one is actually strengthening the actual supply of viable customers, so strengthening the value chains collectively. I'll stop. I'm sure Bill has something to say.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'll give you the floor immediately, Bill. Just perhaps to add a question. First, I think Suzanne was mentioning that there's a need to bring the financiers at a very early stage, and I guess she was not using financier in singular but in plural. So it's if they come early together, that might help this connection. And Bill, when you address this question, could you perhaps also address the question of Durga Kaki, who is from Nepal, mentioning the problem? It is a very interesting parallel discussion in the chat, but that is talking about the issue of weather conditions and change of climate that makes sometimes the production, and I can imagine, especially for smallholder farmers that are more susceptible for these changes, more difficult. So how do you ensure, when you think about consumers, and there was also another question saying, what if consumers do not care about quality and sustainability? How do you brand your product, and also how do you ensure that, especially with small producers, you have a reliable source that is of production that is coming to the markets, and these are the level of risks that are quite high.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm adding to
okay.
your plate of comments.
That's a lot of comments, but I wanted. Creating market systems requires a lot of upfront facilitation and getting people together. And I do think it's a role for donors to play, or for them to invest in other organizations who do this as a service. For instance, I was on the board of Mixed Market, which was in charge of really addressing the information asymmetries between investors who wanted to invest in microfinance institutions around the world, because there was a major, they didn't know who the good were, they didn't know how to invest, and so Mixed Market, actually starting in about 2002, by 2015, 2016 had solved that problem. And so the financial institutions, were the investors were investing now billions of dollars into these MFIs. They hadn't known who the good ones were before. And so systems were put up. In fact, private systems were put in place that could address this. We have somebody else that's got their mic open. Can we? Yeah. But then fintech comes along. So we fixed that problem. And it was an investment, and it took 10 years, but it's now working pretty well. There are commercial solutions. Investors can find MFIs. The fintechs come along, and the fintechs are really transforming things. But fintechs are small. And there are lots of investors who said, well, we would like to invest in fintechs, but we don't know who the good fintechs are. And so we said, well, what if we put together a competition for all the fintechs to apply? And the investors said, fantastic, we would love this. And we went out and we got 50 investors. Every single investor we spoke to said, we want to be on the judging panel. We want to see these fintechs coming in, because they didn't know who the best ones were. And so when we did the competition, we got, I think, 800 or 1,000 applications. The 50 people went through all the applications, and they selected the 25 best. But this was an NGO that was doing this, and it was their business. So it doesn't always have to be the donors doing it, but finding the right organizations or supporting those organizations to do it. And now this is a regular annual competition, which is going on, and it's really bridging the information asymmetries between the two sides. So that was a practical example that, it was the donors, we got funding from MasterCard Foundation, put in 50,000, then an insurance company put in 50,000, and so we cobbled together a couple of $250,000 of funding to actually do this. But it took the role out of the donors' hands to have to do, and put it into an organization whose purpose was to do that. Durga Karki.
In 1 minute.
Yeah, in 1 minute. Well, I think the input suppliers need to be producing seeds that are relevant to the new climate. This is maybe the shorter growing season. I don't know Nepali agriculture well enough. But to suggest your food security at a national level, sorry, it's just too big of a question to tackle in 1 minute.
Okay. Yeah, I think, well, there's probably no miracle solutions. But since you mentioned we were also talking about the change of climate, let me perhaps just add that addressing the climate adaptation, which we also see donors and financiers not putting enough effort in financing climate adaptation, and to ensure that you have a resilient agricultural production in the fact of climate change is also a key element. We're coming to,
but we're seeing seed companies change their product. I mean, they're looking at the market environments. They're looking and saying, well, the growing season is shifting from 110 days to 90 days. So we need to produce seed that will germinate and produce in 90 days. So, this is happening. The private sector is investing in these solutions already. But the more support they can get, the faster they'll do it. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Perhaps can I just, because we're coming to a close of our fascinating discussion, unfortunately, I would like to have double the time. But perhaps can I ask each of you some of perhaps final thoughts and recommendations about how to move forward and to have an inclusive way forward. Matt, do you want to start? We cannot hear you. Still a problem of,
Someone keeps muting me. I think your questions are not getting easier. I think what I see from the panel today is the people who have some experience are coming up with very similar approaches, and that there's no silver bullet. People who ask us for the game changes where we all try to make meaningful contributions. The game will change over time. It'll take a while, and it takes a collective effort. I think that's coming out very clearly today. I suspect we've all come at it from a slightly different perspective, but it is a systemic issue. It's not that someone's going to find a magic solution that then we can apply. We hadn't thought of it 40 years ago or 20 years ago when Bill was working and I was at school. It does require the set of actors, and you've got to be honest and say we need to all bring people together. That doesn't mean everyone has to work in a great big happy family forever, because there are trade-offs. There will be genuine negotiations, but there is a real task for the public sector, and that includes the donors, but it doesn't give the donors like me the right to tell people what to do in the local context, but you do need to make sure that the local context is adapting. So I'm sorry, it's a woolly, fluffy one.
No, not at all.
I think, one is really
relevant.
trying to reduce the gap a bit between what the public sector does and what the genuine financiers are trying to do. I think the finance, I feel that from a donor perspective, a bit of self-criticism, we still remain too far removed from the actions that the genuine financiers are trying to put in place, and we don't quite manage to connect up the sort of interventions that we are funding. And so there's one where we can try to advance to address that gap, but it's not going to be one that's quick. Sorry.
Thank you. Susan, in a couple of sentences.
You know me too well, huh? Yeah. Okay, I'll try. No, I think the food system approach, as we see it happening now in the food system summit uprun, I think that says it all. There are beautiful models, business models, and business cases to be found. And if larger institutes, FAO, World Bank, European Commission, maybe also Rabobank, are able to identify the transitions that are necessary, the sustainability transitions, and how smallholders can play a major part, a contribution in that, you do have beautiful solutions, like in food loss and waste reduction, but for instance, also in the decarbonization pathways. With agroforestry, for instance, there are beautiful solutions. So if we could do that instead of taking a country approach, I think that would help also, because then you have the right stakeholders that can really have influence on these sustainability transitions, and that will help get the right funding at the right people. And secondly, I think, yeah, digitization, it's the key word. Bettina knows we're very closely engaged together also in an idea to map and merge more like digitized smallholder ecosystem solutions. I think there's a lot to win in that field, and what we are doing ourselves as a bank is trying to get more insights in the value chain as a whole, in the build-up of the value chain, by creating a traceability platform. We're piloting already in some sectors, like bananas in Colombia, for instance, and that really helps to get this true pricing that I called for in the beginning, because then you can indeed have supermarket chains and consumers paying a little bit more for that extra effort that is being done to get more social incomes and to get more sustainable products.
Great. We have not coordinated on this, but this is a topic of our next webinar on the 9th of June. So thank you for explaining why it does matter, digitalization. Bill, perhaps just in one sentence, we're really going over time.
Getting the market systems working together, making sure that the value is understood, and that you have systems to get the information from the consumer down to the farmer, and make sure that each member of the value chain is producing with a common eye towards delivering the highest value good to the end market.
Yeah, thank you. And Bettina, you were
half a sentence.
You open our panel to conclude it.
So let me say, I don't need to repeat anything that has already been said. So that is great. I think that's what I've missed a little bit maybe from the conversation, and I think it's important is unpack the financial ecosystem. You know, you spoke about financiers, Stan. We need different types of investors and financial service providers around the table. They are not the same. This is a very, very diverse ecosystem that we need to engage. And we need to be much more sophisticated in understanding who is the best fit, where, for what along the value chain. The second message I would have is agri-SMEs. We talk a lot about smallholders and larger corporates. Agri-SMEs are a huge, huge part of food systems. And they're really key connectors, between the supply and demand, consumer and producers, but also key originators of innovative business models. And that connects me to the last point. Yes, bring all the different actors together, have the broad, ecosystem vision, but also we need to be constantly alert to the fact that there are disruptive business models that can pop up within markets and have, ripple effects. So it doesn't all need to come down from a master plan. There's a bottom-up process of change and a more top-down or coordination grounded approach. Over. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I cannot summarize now myself in 1 minute the richness of the discussion, but perhaps just allow me also to highlight some of the points. You've used some of the terms that were, from we all talked about market forces and the importance of linking up actors. And the role that public actors also might have in shaping markets and the connection between the public and private, which I think is important. We've heard the words of market systems, ecosystems, the need to think about from producers to consumers. And I think that's perhaps, what I retain is that there is sometimes a tendency to either look at the overall problem of agriculture and saying, and then we have a bit the way we started, or how we're going to solve this amazing issue, or sometimes then to narrow it down to very specific projects and saying, well, that has an impact. But in fact, what we see is probably somewhere in between, to be realistic, where we can link the different actors, and as you're mentioning, Bettina, the different actors of the system, and in terms of financiers, to bring them in very early on. Sometimes it's an afterthought, or it's an aside from the discussion, or financiers among themselves, which are not necessarily understood by the non-financing people. And what is important to perhaps keep in mind is that there's a lot of very different actors, as you were mentioning, among the financiers also, different incentives, different interests, different business models that can be reconciled. So perhaps this approach, in one way or the others, of thinking of platform, of linking up different actors together from the early stage, might be a way forwards. And then I would encourage you to look at what both Rabobank, the Commission, Safin, IFAD, very interesting publication, and DAI definitely many interesting reports that I've read also preparing this from Bill. That's I think what is encouraging is that there are many innovative solutions that are put forward. So it is perhaps to try to draw on these innovative good cases and to think how actors can be coming better together from a local perspective, a bottom-up approach, not trying to think there will be a single model. But thank you very much for this very interesting discussion that we had. We hope that you all enjoy. I would like to thank you all for your very active participation. I would like to thank my friends at DAI that help us to put this series together, and I welcome you all, and including also my friends at ECDPM, and I welcome you all to the next webinar that will be on the 9th of June on the digital inclusion. Thank you very much, and have a good end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Sam.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.